Hello everyone, my name is Dr. Glenn Fox, and we will be discussing the osteology of the neck. This is the first video of several learning objective videos which describes the anatomy of the neck, and I am so honored to be the one to instruct you on this journey of understanding. So we'll focus on the neck as a region of anatomy, its osteological substructure, as well as the unique features of cervical vertebrae and the particular features of the first, second, and seventh cervical vertebrae. So the neck as a region really connects a couple of very interesting parts of the body. So first of all, it is the main conduit between the head and the thorax. And so there are a lot of important systems which are going to traverse this space. So looking at the cross section, here is anterior and here is posterior. We can see that there are a number of different elements within the neck. So in particular, there are portions of the respiratory tract, such as the larynx and trachea, and portions of the pharynx which traverse the neck. There are portions of the gastrointestinal tract or the alimentary canal, namely the esophagus and pharynx, which traverse the neck. There are portions of the cardiovascular system, various arteries and veins, which are traversing the neck. Portions of the nervous system, so particular nerves and nervous features, as well as the spinal cord, which traverses the neck. And obviously, parts of the musculoskeletal system. So here we can see a vertebrae and the muscles which are surrounding that vertebrae. So various muscles of the neck, which we will discuss. So let's think of that osteological substructure of the neck. Well, there are two major parts to this, the lion's share of which is the cervical spine, sometimes just called the C-spine for short. The C-spine is a series of vertebrae, so this is part of the vertebral column, that begins with C1, or the first cervical vertebrae that's articulating with the occipital bone of the skull, and goes down to the seventh cervical vertebrae, which sits atop T1, or the first thoracic vertebrae. So this is the major osteological support of the neck. The other major osteological structure of the neck is the hyoid bone, which we can see here. The hyoid bone is sitting anterior to the vertebral column of the C-spine, posterior to the mandible, and inferior to the remainder of the skull. So let's start with the hyoid bone. Let's address this first and then focus on the C-spine. The hyoid bone gets its name from hyoideus, which means shaped like an epsilon or a U. It's a very unique bone in that it has no direct articulation with any other bone in the body. It is suspended by musculature and the tendons of those muscles within the neck. It sits anterior to the C-spine at about the level of C4, posterior to the mandible, inferior from the cranium. And so it's really a prominent anterior neck feature. So if you were to put your finger just underneath your chin and move it inferiorly down your neck, that first firm, palpable structure is your hyoid bone. The hyoid bone is an important support for the airway. The larynx, which is the voice box, or the proximal part of the dedicated airway space, it hangs from the hyoid bone by a thyrohyoid membrane. And it's really giving support to a number of different muscle groups, muscles that are extrinsic to the tongue, various suprahyoid muscles, which are found in this area, inferior to the skull but superior to the hyoid, attach to the hyoid bone. So it is a very important supportive muscle. And we'll go into the granular details in subsequent videos and sessions. So let's talk a little bit about the vertebral column. So the vertebral column is a series of vertebrae which are interspersed by intervertebral discs. So the bodies of vertebrae, we'll get into the specifics of vertebral anatomy shortly, are the anterior elements of the vertebral column, and the intervertebral discs sit between the vertebral bodies. These intervertebral discs have two components. There's the annulus fibrosus, which is a very rough and tumble collagenous feature that is surrounding and containing the nucleus pulposus, which is more of a gelatinous structure. If you've heard of a herniation or a slipped disc, what happens is that annulus fibrosus is weakened and the nucleus pulposus herniates or pushes through to potentially impinge on spinal nerves or their branches. Those spinal nerves are coming from the spinal cord, which occupies the vertebral canal, and they're conveyed through intervertebral foramina. Intervertebral because it's between two vertebrae, and foramina is plural of foramen, which is a hole or a window in bone. And so spinal nerves will exit through those intervertebral foramina. The vertebral column has a number of functions. It is protective of the spinal cord, so it nearly completely encases it in bone, and it allows for special movements of the back and neck, such as flexion and extension, such as bowing forward or becoming upright, lateral flexion, which would be bending to the side, or rotation, which would be twisting about the vertebral column as an axis. The vertebral column is also going to be an excellent location for attachment sites for other bones and muscles. So let's take a look at an individual vertebrae and its particular anatomy. So anterior is here. The largest individual constituent of the vertebrae is the body, and that's the part that's sitting anteriorly. And coming off of that body is the vertebral arch. So it's all of that. And the two major constituents of the vertebral arch are the pedicels, you can see attached to the body, and the laminae. Laminae means plate or sheets. You can see the laminae coming together. So the laminae, pedicels, and body are going to surround the vertebral foramen. And those vertebral foramen or vertebral foramina will align to form the vertebral or spinal canal. That's where the spinal cord lives. Now, coming off of that vertebral arch are going to be two different types of processes. So there are going to be lateral or posterolateral processes called transverse processes, which we can see here. And then there's going to be a central posteriorly oriented spinous process. And it's typically the spinous processes which are palpable down the midline of an individual's back. So the first 7 vertebrae are referred to as cervical vertebrae or vertebrae of the neck, aka the C-spine. And they're very unique amongst the vertebrae of the vertebral column in that they possess an additional set of foramina called the transverse foramen, which we can see in close association with the transverse process of the cervical vertebrae. It's through these transverse foramina that we'll have vertebral arteries and veins. These are vessels which specifically serve the brain, travel. Another unique feature of cervical vertebrae, in particular cervical vertebrae 2 through 6, are that their spinous processes are bifid, or divided into two parts, like so. Some more strongly than others. Now, there are 3 cervical vertebrae that we'll discuss as unique. The first is the C1, or atlas vertebrae. The C1 vertebrae articulates with the occipital bone of the skull, so it holds up the skull. It gets its name from the mythological person Atlas, who was charged with holding up the world, and I guess the skull is our world. It's very unique among the vertebrae in that it appears to be just a ring of bone. There is no body whatsoever. This is the anterior part of this vertebrae, and anterior of the illustration is there. What happens to that body is that it delaminates during early development, and it sticks to C2 as the dens, or the odontoid process, which we'll discuss shortly. So we can see there are pretty unique features here. These are articular facets of C1. These are going to articulate with the occipital condyles of the skull. And so the joint is called the atlanto-occipital joint. And if you were to articulate the atlanto-occipital joint, the action would be nodding the head as if to indicate yes. Next up, C2, or the axis. It's called the axis because the first cervical vertebrae can pivot about that dens. So that dens sticks up from the body of C2. That is also anterior. And we have, this is the anterior part of the illustration. And this forms the atlanto-axial joint with C1. So as C1 pivots about that dens, it's as if you're shaking the head to indicate no. And then finally, we have the 7th cervical vertebrae, oftentimes called Vertebra prominens, because it has a very prominent spinous process. If you were to put your hand on the posterior aspect of your neck and move down towards your thorax, that first major palpable spinous process is going to be the spinous process of C7. It's unique among the cervical vertebrae in that it is non-bifid, so it is singular, just like the thoracic vertebrae to follow. So that leads us to our assessment question, and that is, what is the space bounded by the laminae, pedicles, in the body of a vertebrae? Is it the foramen magnum? No, that's of the occipital bone. Is it the intervertebral foramen? No, that's between vertebrae laterally, those vertebral notches that allow the spinal nerves an opportunity to leave. Is it the transverse foramen? No, that's unique to cervical vertebrae, and that's the space for vertebral arteries and vein. So that leaves the vertebral foramen. Yes, that's correct. The vertebral foramen stack one on top of the other, so those vertebral foramina in total are going to form the vertebral canal or spinal canal, which is where the spinal cord lives. Thank you so much for your time, and I'll see you in video 2.